There are business requirements, and then there are good business requirements. And good business requirements always have certain characteristics in common. And so in this video, I want to walk you through some of the most common characteristics that good business requirements should have. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is a list of the top 4 things that I always try to make sure I incorporate into the business requirements documents that I produce. Number 1 is that any analyst producing good business requirements will always make sure that they've exhausted all of the different sources that need to be exhausted in order to get a complete picture for their business requirements. And many analysts out there may assume that engaging their customers and their clients and starting a conversation around business requirements is the first or the primary source of their requirements. And it is not close to being the first source. And it isn't always even the primary source, even though most of the time it is. But if your customer conversations are the only source of requirements that you have, then there are many other sources that you should be consulting that you may not be taking into account, which can sometimes lead to you not discovering requirements earlier enough in the process, which can create a lot of major other problems downstream for you in the project, all right? So the first major characteristic of good requirements is for the analyst to make sure that they have exhausted all of the major sources of requirements that need to be consulted or looked at to gain a complete picture. The second major aspect of a good set of requirements is the fact that there are always certain basic elements that must be included in those requirements documents. Now, there is no real global standard for what business requirements should look like, but there are certain elements that you have to include into your documents to make sure that you're not missing anybody's view of the requirements, and there are certain dimensions that need to be always consulted, and you need to make sure that you have certain elements within those requirements. Some of these elements we're going to be covering in much more depth in our business requirements and functional specifications course, but you always want to make sure that you are covering the key elements in your business requirements. The third major characteristic of good business requirements is that your customers are, it is easy for your customers to agree to what the requirements document, or however you're documenting your requirements. It's easy for them to agree to what's written on paper. And this might seem like it's common sense, but you'd be very surprised at the number of times that a set of requirements gets produced, and when it's presented to the customer for sign off or for agreement, you'll see that they have some major objections. And so there is agreement from one customer. And then again, more importantly, if you have multiple stakeholders on your project and for your requirements, you have to make sure that all of those different customers are in agreement with each other about what is written in the business requirements. And so third major characteristic of good requirements is that it is very agreeable. It's relatively easy for people to agree to it. You're not ever in a situation where you present a document to your customers and they're either confused about what's written in there and they don't really understand it, or some of their wishes or some of their needs are not expressed in those documents. And so, and those types of obstacles don't exist in your requirements, because those are the types of things that can hold a project back, all right? The fourth major characteristic of good requirements is their ability to flow downstream into the next stage of the project. And typically when you produce business requirements, there is another step after that where you have to do a lot more detailed elaboration on those requirements to make sure that you've brought things down to the level of detail that the technical team needs to be able to actually build whatever solution that the requirements are for. And if you structure your requirements in some ways of structuring documents can make it much easier for those requirements to flow into the elaboration phase of your project than if you were to write them in other ways. And so again, that is part of what makes requirements different from good requirements. Good requirements should be relatively easy for you to break apart into components, and it should be very relatively easy for you to plan out the elaboration and execute the elaboration based on the way that you've written your requirements. Now, these 4 characteristics are just some of the characteristics that we're going to be covering in our upcoming business requirements and functional specifications course. And my goals for this course very simply are to make sure that any student that enrolls into the course walks away knowing exactly what the difference between good and not good requirements are. And more importantly, they have the ability to produce those requirements along with the functional specifications, which I'll talk about in a separate video. The way we're going to do that is that we are going to look at multiple examples of different types of requirements documents for our sample company called Peterson and Baker. And if you have been following us for any period of time, you've already run into some of the characters that we have at Peterson and Baker and some of the employees that work there. But that company, Peterson and Baker, is going to be in a situation where they are looking at revamping their entire procurement process. And so we're going to start looking at the requirements and the specification documents that one would produce for such a project. And so that is the way that we're actually going to be learning about the difference between good requirements and regular requirements. So I want to make sure that you're continuing to follow us, and I'll be releasing more videos to talk about the requirements and functional specifications course and about the business analysis profession in general. If you're interested in improving the way that you produce your requirements and specifications, then I'll get you to join our community and to make sure that you're going through some of the content, but more importantly, you want to make sure you understand what's in the curriculum of the next upcoming course that we have so that you can decide whether the course is a good fit for you or not. So I'll leave this one here and I'll see you on the next video where I'll be talking to you about functional specifications.